Today we're going to explore James and Diep's wedding in the heart of the forest. A day that almost fell apart when their DIY floral arch collapsed and everything felt like it was going wrong. But just as James starts to doubt he can give Diep the life she deserves, a luxury car pulls up with an unexpected gift that changes their future forever. What happens when forgiveness shows up where judgment was expected? The morning sun slips through the cinnamon leaves and paints the yard with little flashes of gold, like someone sprinkled glitter across the ground. Out front, everything feels different today, lighter, softer. Diep isn't in her usual muddy work clothes. She's wearing a simple white owl dye, clean and graceful, and she's focused like it's the most important mission in the world. Carefully weaving wildflowers into a tiny crown for little Nee. Nee sits still for about 3 seconds because she's a kid, then wiggles again, giggling while Diep tries to make the crown fit just right. The whole scene feels like a quiet kind of magic. Not fancy, not stage, just real. Then James appears from behind the hut, stepping into the sunlight. He's in a white shirt with the collar casually unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up like he's trying to prove to the universe he can do manual labor today. In his hands are bamboo poles, and he's wrestling with them like they're fighting back. He's building a DIY floral arch with that "I watched one video and now I'm confident" energy. "Are you sure this is stable?" Diep asks, still threading flowers. James steps back, squints like an architect, and says, "It's stable enough." That's exactly when the highland wind decides to humble him. A sudden whirlwind sweeps through the yard, fast, sharp, like the mountain itself just took a breath. The bamboo arch shudders, leans, and collapses with a loud crash. And the worst part? Right under it are the imported roses James ordered from the city, the ones he kept talking about like they were the final touch. Now they're flattened, petals crushed, stems snapped. James freezes. He doesn't yell. He just stares at the ruin, and you can see it hit him, that old fear that he's not giving her enough. His shoulders drop. His face tightens like he's trying to swallow disappointment. Diep notices instantly. She sets the flower crown down gently, walks over and takes his hand. His rough, hard-working hand that's not used to being held for comfort. "Don't be sad, James," she says softly. "My forest flowers are the most beautiful, and we only need each other." James looks at her, really looks at her, and it's like the noise in his head fades. The pressure, the expectations, the invisible voices saying a wedding has to look a certain way. They loosen their grip. Instead of calling an event planner or making frantic city phone calls, James takes a breath and chooses a different path. He leans into his CEO mindset and says, "Okay, time to restructure." Only this time the goal isn't profit, it's meaning. He heads to the wood workshop and gathers the carpenters. Together they build rustic furniture from scrap wood, tables, benches, little stands for food trays. Nothing matches perfectly, but somehow it all fits. James learns in real time, measuring, sanding, hammering, sweating, laughing when he messes up. Meanwhile, Diep and Mrs. Huyen prepare the wedding feast with local products, the kind of food that doesn't need decoration because it already tastes like home. Red sticky rice, hill chicken, forest bamboo shoots. The air turns warm and fragrant. And in the middle of it all, Mrs. Huyen watches quietly, steady as a pillar. When Diep is ready, Mrs. Huyen calls her over and opens her palm to reveal a gold heirloom hairpin, simple but unmistakably precious. She pins it into Diep's hair with gentle fingers, eyes shining. "You taught James how to cherish simple things," she says, "and that is the greatest wedding gift?" Diep blinks fast, emotion rising in her throat. Acceptance doesn't need a speech. It lands straight in the heart. In the corner of the yard, James is working again, learning rope knots to secure the new floral arch. No imported roses now, just white pampas grass, dried cinnamon branches, wildflowers, and what the forest willingly gives. The scent is sweet and earthy, wrapping around the yard like a blessing. Every knot James tightens feels symbolic, like he's fastening himself to this life, this family, this way of loving. And for the first time, there's no his world and her world. No class gap, no separation, just one world, one family. And the wedding, unfinished, imperfect, handmade, starts to look more beautiful than anything money could ever design. The emotional peak hits when Mr. Hone arrives, not with an argument, not with that cold, judging look Diep has been bracing for. A luxury car rolls up at the edge of the yard, engine cutting off like it's unsure it belongs here. The door opens. Mr. Hone steps out, neat, controlled, but strangely quiet, as if he left his pride in the back seat. For a moment, nobody moves. Even the villagers' chatter drops. Diep's hands go cold. Old memories surge up. Shame, fear, the feeling of never being enough. She takes half a step back on instinct. James notices and shifts closer, ready to stand between them. But Mr. Hone doesn't come in with authority. He walks forward slowly, holding a folder in both hands like it weighs more than paper. He stops in front of them, looks at James, then at Diep. "This is the land title for the hill behind the workshop," he says, placing it into their hands. "I bought it for you, so you can expand the agricultural workshop." Diep stares down at the document like it might vanish. Her breath catches. Because this isn't just land. This is approval, spoken in the only language Mr. Hone ever seemed fluent in. Action. James's fingers tighten around the paper. He looks at his father, searching his face for the catch. Mr. Hone clears his throat, eyes softening just slightly. "I thought I was protecting you," he says to James, "but I was really controlling you." He pauses, then adds quietly, "And I hurt her in the process." Diep's vision blurs. She's waited so long for something like this, but now that it's here, it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like a knot finally loosening after years. She lifts her eyes to Mr. Hone. Her lips tremble, and the tears come fast. Fear, grief, love, relief all at once. And instead of shrinking away, Diep steps forward and hugs him. It starts small, hesitant, like she's afraid he'll pull away, then becomes real, tight, human, forgiveness mixing with apology in the same breath. Mr. Hone stiffens in surprise, then slowly raises his hands and rests them on her back. That tiny gesture says more than any speech could. James stands beside them, one arm around Diep's shoulder, the other reaching for his father's hand. And in that moment, he feels something money could never buy. Wholeness. Behind them, the yard exhales. Someone turns the villagers' old speakers back up, and the rhythmic music returns, crackly, offbeat, and perfect. Little niece squeals and runs in circles with Hockey the dog, who sprints after her like he's part of the wedding crew. Kids laugh, adults clap. Someone throws out a playful comment, and the tension finally breaks into warm laughter. As evening settles in, the ceremony melts into something more intimate, a big bonfire in the middle of the yard. Flames dance upward, lighting faces in orange and gold. The forest becomes a dark, protective wall, and the world feels like it shrinks into this circle of warmth. James is no longer Chairman James. No icy persona. He's sitting on a log beside Diep, smoke curling around him, turning corn over the fire and trying not to burn it. Little Nye hovers like a tiny supervisor, reacting dramatically every time a kernel pops. Diep leans her head on James's shoulder, tired in the sweetest way. In her hands is a worn notebook, creased pages, handwritten notes. She opens it and shows him, proud like a kid showing a gold star. "My first orders," she says softly, I closed them today, on our wedding day. James studies the names, the numbers, the little notes in the margins, and his chest tightens with awe. This is what building a life looks like. Small victories, earned honestly, written down carefully. He kisses her forehead, slow and gentle. We're going to build it together, he whispers. The Lytudiep agricultural brand, not just a name, but a home for everyone who believes in this life. Diep smiles through tears and nods against his shoulder, like she's saying yes to the future itself. At their feet, Haki lies curled up, finally tired, eyes half closed in peace. The fire crackles, the villagers keep singing. The air smells like cinnamon and smoke and fresh earth. And the camera holds on that warmth, because that's the truth of it. Love isn't about finding a perfect world. It's about building a peaceful world together, from the smallest things.
Đám cưới giữa rừng của James và Diệp sắp tan vỡ thì cổng hoa tự dưng bị gió sập, những đóa hồng nhập khẩu cuốn nát. James chạnh lòng vì nghĩ rằng mình chưa cho cô đủ đầy, nhưng Diệp dịu dàng nắm tay anh, khẳng định chỉ cần có nhau là đủ. Thay vì chạy theo hình thức, James cùng mọi người dựng lại không gian cưới bằng gỗ mộc và hoa rừng ấm áp và chân thành. Cao trào đến khi ông Hoan xuất hiện với tờ giấy mảnh đất làm quà cưới, thừa nhận sai lầm và trao cho họ sự ủng hộ bằng hành động. Diệp xúc động ôm ông, hóa giải những tổn thương cũ. Bên ánh lửa đêm, giữa tiếng cười của dân làng, họ hiểu rằng hạnh phúc không nằm ở sự hoàn hảo, mà ở việc cùng nhau xây dựng tương lai bằng tình yêu và sự tha thứ.